for his family the first chance he got. And the house was so important to him that later, when he was able to build a house out of a clapboard or, just a regular wooden house, he didn't tear down the cabin. He built another house around the first house that he was able to own.
Can you tell me about the other places that you've traveled to walk in the steps of your family? I think you traveled to Ghana with the slaveholding fortress in New York and other areas as well.
Well, I went to Lagos, Portugal, where the slave trade began, and because I just wanted to get a real sense of this history. But that turned out to be it was kind of a disappointing experience, because I really wanted to see the slave stockades where, stolen people had been chained, and that location had been taken over by a concession stand, and that was just ludicrous, to me, and extremely disappointing. And then after that, I decided I wanted to actually trace Mandy's footsteps as best I could. So that's when I went to Ghana, West Africa, and I went to Elmina Castle, which she may have been held there before being transported on a slave ship over to the U.S. But that, it's really hard to put into words what that was like, because I grew up in Oakland, California, in a kind of, I don't want to use the word privileged. I was kind of spoiled. I was well taken care of. I never had a hungry moment, but I was a Black woman. And when I got to this slave fortress and it got to where the women were held, I could just really feel myself in there. And I could feel myself being crowded in among other women who had been stolen away from everything and didn't know what was going to be next for them. So it became a very personal kind of experience. And then I went to Baltimore, Maryland later, and there in the Great Black Figures in Wax Museum in Baltimore has a replica of a slave ship. And, I walk in there and they have exhibits of many things that would have happened on the Middle Passage. But the thing that was most compelling to me was the impending rape of a captive slave woman. And I say impending because what it shows is just this ship's officer hovering above her, and her her fear. I could just feel her fear, knowing what the next step was, knowing what was going to happen. And later in the museum, I was really heartbroken by wax figures of little boys who were, sort of crowded together. I'm a retired pediatrician, so seeing those children was, just heartbreaking for me. And I just kept wondering, would I have been able to survive? Mandy did, and countless other enslaved women did, but I just couldn't imagine ever being that strong, having that amount of inner strength and determination to live. But those were among my travels. And of course, I went to Montpelier several times. And the first time I had a very emotional experience. I'm just reaching for words to describe that. I was able to walk in Coreen's footsteps, literally walk in an ancestor's footsteps, because on the back of the mansion at Montpelier, there was a groove a groove in the ground that led from where the kitchen would have been, or not to the kitchen, I'm sorry, I'm saying this backwards. It would have led from where the Madisons would have been served all the way out to a kitchen that was about 70 yards away, where Coreen would have walked back and forth as she and other enslaved cooks were bringing food to and from, the mansion. And it just made me feel part of her and part of belonging to Montpelier. And my connection there, I have 3 generations of enslaved ancestors there, Vandy, Coreen, and Jim. And I felt that I was just able to be there with them.
Well, I have a question that I think gets to the heart of what you have been describing here about remembering the past. And there's a lot of different opinions, and I want to hear your opinion. And bear with me, it might take a minute to set this up. So the question of how to remember James Madison and by extension other founding fathers, where James Madison, he's called the father of the Constitution. He wrote the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, co-wrote the Federalist Papers, and made the possibility for a lot of the ideals of America to happen, for freedom of speech, for equality among citizens. But obviously, in his personal life, he didn't live that out. He owned people. They had no rights whatsoever legally. He, whatever the relationship with Coreen would be exploitative just by the different status they did have, and everything that you described to with Coreen, with Mandy's story as well. There were terrible things happening here. And in order to understand the sides of the story, I mean, different people have looked at this in different ways, where the New York Times has recently had the 1619 Project that argues that slavery is in the very DNA of the United States. It formed its economy, its legal system, and that existed past emancipation into the Jim Crow era, and many would argue in the 21st century. On the other side, coming from the other direction, I have listeners that I think they push back against that narrative. And one person wrote in saying that he has a family member who does historical reenactments at Faneuil Hall in Boston. It's this shopping center that has historical buildings where reenactors perform. And I think he did John Adams, but he was distressed because he heard the organizers wanted to abandon the subjects of John Adams and the other founding fathers and replace it with a model slave auction. And he said, well, I could get that if you had a slave auction in something like Richmond, Virginia, where there was a famous one, but Boston was the birth of the abolitionist movement, and they sent an enormous amount of Union soldiers to fight and die in the Civil War. So his perspective is sort of, by making absolutely everything about slavery with the founding fathers, we're lumping in with, I don't know, the Barbary pirates and people that have absolutely no redeeming values. And we're disregarding that even if they didn't practice the equality of all people, they at least created a system where that dream could one day be realized. So that's a very long way to say that there's a lot of different opinions about this, and you know this better than anyone else. So how do you what is your take on this legacy?
Well, as you said, slavery is in the DNA of this country, and it never would have been what it is without the labor of the slaves. But the Constitution itself set up a means of, I don't want to use the word justifying because there is no justification, but it sets the country up for making African Americans lesser. And in much of the country, in different ways, as you go from different areas of the country, African Americans are viewed as lesser. So when James Madison decided that the slaves would be counted as 3/5, each slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person in terms of a taxation and representation, that makes them lesser. In calling them other persons instead of calling them slaves, it's a kind of very odd term that I've never really understood how they came to make that decision. But by calling them other, it makes them lesser. It makes them outsiders, certainly. It excludes them from many of the benefits that the Constitution was written to guarantee. But what's particularly odd about it, I think, is that they do use the word persons. So even though they're human beings, they're not entitled to the same rights. And then this attitude of lesser is passed on in other documents before slavery, where slaves aren't even named, and lesser during the Reconstruction period, where the ideals that are laid down in the Constitution are not really enforced in a way that allows the former slaves to have a true level of freedom. And in the Jim Crow area and the Black laws just continue on and amplify that same idea that African Americans are lesser and less deserving. Even with the 14th and 15th Amendments, they're still not quite as respected throughout much of the country at that time. And you can see the fallout today.
Absolutely. So what do you hope people would take away from your story, where your family's motto was always remember you're a Madison, and then your grandfather, or was it great-grandfather, who added the addendum of being related to a president? So there's pride there, but then you're also walking in the footsteps of others, of Mandy, of Coreen. And what do you hope that people get out of this story?
Let me just back up just a tiny bit. There were two addendums. So the first one was that my great-great-grandfather, Mac, added, you descend from a president. And then my grandfather, John Chester, whom I call Gramps, added, and African slaves. And that is critical. So the whole credo now is always remember you're a Madison. You come from a president and African slaves. And so what I want to accomplish in the book is that and African slaves is critical and important. And my family is not the only one that descended from a remarkable people. Slaves possessed a sense of hope and inner strength by which they survived. They also possessed many skills and talents by which they contributed mightily to this country. But those qualities did not die with the slaves. Those qualities were passed down to their descendants from generation to generation, including today's young people. And I want young people to really recognize and be proud of their slave ancestry and to embrace it within themselves and to know that they have these same abilities. And I would like it to become one means, among others, but one means of combating racism, at least especially how they view themselves, how young Black people view themselves. They too have strengths and talents and the ability to fulfill their dreams.